I would like for you please to give a warm welcome to our guest tonight, Mr. James C Johnston.
Thank you very much. One of the main impetus of my book is to dispel a myth, and that myth is the docility of the slave. The slave was not a docile participant in his own miserable condition. When I was a young undergraduate, almost half a century ago, many noteworthy lecturers used to come to my school. Among them were Louis Untermeyer, whom I spent an entire day with, and the other one was the great historian Henry Steele Commager. Now, Untermeyer was a remarkable man. At the time he came to the school, he was in his 80s, and he was feisty, and he had been to the school before in the 30s, but now he was back. And he was so magnetic, so full of life, that for the rest of the day, we just followed him around. We didn't go to classes. When we were kicked out of the auditorium, we went somewhere. He says, "Where can we go now?" "Well, let's go to the library." When we kicked out of the library, "Well, where can we go now?" "Or we can find a lecture hall somewhere." And we just went to the end of the day. By the end of the day, there were 5 of us with him. And he was remarkable. He was remarkable for a number of things. One is that he never graduated from high school. As a matter of fact, he spent 3 years in the sophomore year of high school, and the reason for that was that they allowed him to play basketball. When they wouldn't let him play basketball anymore, he quit the school, and he became a reporter. And from there on, his career took off. He became one of the greatest editors and anthologists and poets that this country ever produced. And my favorite poem of his was A Summer Storm. He was wonderful. He was young. He was vital. Henry Steele Commager was somebody I was really looking forward to seeing. But I'm afraid he turned out to be rather a disappointment. And I can see that some people were quite enthusiastic about his name when I said it, so I'm terribly upset that I have to disembarrass you about some truths of this man's greatness. By the time he was 28, he had earned PhDs. He had an earned PhD as well as an MA and a BA. And in 1930, he collaborated with Samuel Eliot Morison on a book, The Growth of the American Republic. Now, in that book, he said some very unfortunate things when he was discussing the Civil War. He made some remarks about slavery which caused me pause in the very, very early 60s. And what he wrote was, as for Sambo, he was better off in slavery than were the peasants of Russia under serfdom. Now, to me, that was an absolutely horrible thing to say. And yet I saw people listen to him as he mouthed these words from the stage without any kind of a response at all. This was 1963. And Commager came to the end of his remarks, and he sat down. And 29 minutes had passed since he began his remarks, and the head of the social studies department got up and walked over to him and whispered in his ear and said to him, "Dr. Commager, you have another half hour to go. You contracted for an hour." So he got up out of his chair and he shambled over to the podium and he delivered exactly the same lecture all over again from the same notes. Now, Dr. Fiore sort of put up his hands like that, and the rest of us smiled and just accepted the eccentricities of the old historian, who was, by the way, 5 years younger than I am now at the time. He was very old indeed. Very, very old. But later on, Bill Cosby would comment on this very thing in this book. And his comment was, "Sambo, Dr. Morrison? Sambo? And that's exactly what I was feeling at that time. That was the most horrible and stupid thing to say. The people of color in the South were not passive. Neither is Samuel or Atashaweo. He's a Matabele prince. He's a member of the nation of the Matabele Zulu who came into South Africa in 1652 at the same time that Jan van Riebeeck arrived at the Cape of Good Hope. And these two nations, the nation of the Boers, the Dutch who were to come into South Africa, and the Zulu collided. And then they each separated into their separate sphere, neither one challenging the other. The Boers had a very healthy respect for the weaponry and the military prowess of the Zulus. Atashaweo is the son of a sub-chief. He is a prince of the Matabele Zulu. He is also full of himself. At 13, he killed his first man. He was a physical giant. He was a member of a race of supermen as far as the Zulu were concerned. They called themselves the chosen of heaven. And they believed that. Or sometimes the children of heaven. And they would preserve their seed until they were 39 years of age. They would not marry until they were 39 years of age. Now, at the beginning of the movie Zulu, which was previously referenced, you might remember Jack Hawkins as the missionary. This was before he got into the room. And his daughter, they're sitting at the King's Kraal in Bulawayo, and they're watching a wedding ceremony. And there are these long lines of very young girls dancing. And they have a little spear or assegai in their right hand, and they have a little shield in their left, and they're dancing opposite these warriors, who to me look very fit and young, but they're all 39 years old, because you could not shed your seed until you were 39. The theory behind that was if you saved yourself, you could run 50 miles a day, fight a battle, and annihilate your enemy. And since warriors of 60 were doing that, there might have been something to it. Although I don't know that that's a program that is going to be adopted anytime soon by the military of the United States, it certainly seemed to work for them. Now, as the master race, if you will, of the area, they look down on every other race, including the Mashona. In fact, the Mashona are constantly being picked on by the Matabele. And it is a Mashona who foolishly attempts to steal some cattle belonging to Atashaweo's father. Atashaweo is now in his 16th year. He is a warrior, and he hears the cattle in distress, and he runs out and he finds a lion attacking the cattle, and he kills the lion, and he contemplates, this wonderful victory, and how I'll have a robe made out of this lion, and how it'll be a wonderful thing, and he's all excited, and he wants to somehow celebrate this, and he knows he can't do it with the women he's seen bathing in the river, because that's totally forbidden. And if he does this, he and his entire family will be bound hand and wrist and thrown over a cliff onto some jagged rocks, because that was the punishment for not adhering to the line. So he hears the cows again being disturbed, and he's thinking, oh good, maybe this is a bigger lion. Maybe I can kill this and get rid of some of this pent-up emotion, if you will. So he goes running out, and it turns out to be something better. It's a lowly Mashona stealing one of his father's cows, stealing part of his father's wealth. And now he's extremely excited, and he chases this Mashana, and the Mashana is terrified because he's being pursued by a Tasha whale. But the Mashana ran on as fast as he could in his state of abject terror because of that same fear. He never looked back. This accursed Mashana's speed was remarkable, as were his long leaps over the grasslands as he sought to escape to some safe place beyond the young Matabili's horrible slashing assegai and the terrible death that must surely follow his capture. The young Matabili thought that the Mashana ran well, even for a member of this accursed tribe. The two youths ran onward for almost an hour, and then as they approached a low hill, the Mashana thief's speed seemed to slacken a bit. As Atashaweo closed in, he sensed his enemy's energy flagging. Atashaweo whooped out more abuse and promises of the most gruesome death in unabashed glee. Yes, he thought, this is just the thing I need to fix me. To Atashaweo, the gods seemed in generous mood that day. Atashaweo rejoiced in the anticipated triumph of yet another honorable kill. This time it was a Mashana thief. The young warrior ran ever faster, almost catching up to his prize. Atashaweo only regretted that he could not make a cloak out of the Mashana's hide. This run for Atashaweo had been merely an almost effortless exercise for his long legs and mighty body. Still, this thief had run well for a lowly Mashana. Suddenly, his joy was compromised by his finding himself surrounded by a dozen Mashana, all armed with spears, clubs, or nets. It suddenly came to him that the whole incident with the cattle had only been a well-planned exercise in duplicity. It was an elaborate trap set up to lure him away from the security of his father's kraal and the proximity of his brothers. The Mashana thief was now smiling, with his gaping mouth open, widely open eyes looking at his late pursuer with utter and total disrespect. The facial expression by the Mashana was a calculated insult. This face which the Mashana youth now portrayed proclaimed his disgust with the Matabili who had chased him to his own detriment as a witless fool. The insult could not be endured by the Matabili warrior. Within a little time, the story would go out that Atashaweo was missing. His brothers and friends would look for him for several days, ranging all the way to the land of the Boers and the English. Their search would not be rewarded with success. For the captive Matabili warrior, it would not be long before a dream of horror entered his now dulled mind as he slowly came to himself through the fog of his almost fatal concussion. A horrible dream was now seizing his mind. He dreamed that he was trussed up and being carried with his body suspended from a pole like a gazelle or an antelope brought back from the hunt. He became aware of his body swaying. His wrists and ankles hurt him, and he felt as if they were on fire with a horrible burning and chafing sensation. His head throbbed as if there were drummers in his skull beating out a fierce tattoo on the taunt drum with their hands made red by their bloody effort. Even his eyes burned with pain of the awful pressure that seemed to swell in his brain against his skull inside of his head. Now his stomach churned as if it were on fire, and this fire moved up from the pit of his stomach to his throat. He dreamed that he vomited, and the taste of blood was in his mouth. And he was captured, and he was in slavery. And he would never hear his name until he returned again to Africa. So that's how we start. And the rest of his journey takes him to Georgia, where he links up with a member of the crew of the selfsame ship who had been beaten for cheating at cards. And they steal gold, they run away from the ship in New Orleans, they make it to Georgia. The young white man apes the manners of the planter class, gets away with it, establishes a plantation. The young warrior, used to command, runs a plantation and makes it the most prosperous one in the neighborhood. And that's where it all begins. The big adventure, the long adventure to freedom by way of Georgia, London, Westmoreland County, Paris, Boston, Nantucket, Rio de Janeiro, back to Mozambique. And I think you should buy this book. Right after you buy this book, which is available tonight, and 10% of which will be donated to the Society's cause. So there you are. Now that you have an idea of what my guy's all about, you have custody of that. That's your book, Tom, everybody knows. I just want to talk about some slave revolts. In 1663, there was a slave revolt in Gloucester County in Virginia, and it was nipped in the bud, but it scared the slaveholders. They beheaded the people who had instigated that revolt. In 1712, in New York City, 25 slaves burned down houses. 9 whites were killed with guns and clubs. Soldiers suppressed the revolt. 18 slave rebels were tortured and executed. In 1800, Gabriel Prosser's rebellion took place, and Prosser, a freed blacksmith, really scared the people in that area. I might add that shortly thereafter, on the island of Haiti, Toussaint de Louverture led a slave revolt, and the first free black slave republic in the world, actually, in the modern period, was established, Haiti. In 1811, the St. John's Rebellion, 500 slaves rebelled and 100 were killed. In 1816, the Fort Blount attack, 300 fugitive slaves waged a battle with the U.S. Army near Apalachicola Bay in Florida. Then, of course, more famously, in 1822, Denmark Vesey's uprising occurred in Charleston. And then in 1831, Nat Turner's Rebellion. And this is the one that gets the publicity. Only 7 people were initially involved. That meant that the possibility of the planters finding out what was going on was rather remote. And that actually scared the people to death. In the South itself, after 1831, the clamps were down, and not too much happened after that by way of open rebellion. However, at sea in 1839, there was a slave revolt aboard the Amistad, which was carrying some African slaves bound for Cuba. And that was led by a fellow by the name of Cinque. And the only 2 people aboard that slave ship of the crew left alive were the mate and the captain, because Cinque knew that they needed somebody to sail and work the ship. However, the captain and the mate betrayed Cinque, and as a result, they weren't sailing them back to Africa and to freedom. The U.S. Navy, however, intercepted the ship, and the blacks were taken into custody, initially charged with mutiny, but they were defended by John Quincy Adams. And Adams used this trial not only to free these Africans who had fought and successfully gained their freedom in the end, but to show what I choose to call the fascist institution of slavery in the South, what it was really like. And it was just as obscene as Nazism was under Adolf Hitler in the Third Reich. And I don't think that that's the way that it was taught to my generation in school. What did we have as our model for what slavery was in the South? Gone with the Wind. Everything was just so nice at Terra. Everybody was having so much fun, singing out in that field, picking that cotton. Big Sam's saying to the fellow who says, "Quitting time," "I'll see when it's quitting time on Terra." And when quitting time, would you notice that quitting time came at nightfall? Because the hours of slave labor, which was the only thing that was remotely accurate in that movie, was from can't see in the morning to can't see at night. Those were the hours of slavery for which there was damn little compensation of any sort whatsoever. Until you were 10 years old, the only article of clothing you would own would be a long shirt that might come down to your knees. And you would only get one a year, perhaps two. And it would be made out of something as coarse as as coarse as sacking. Now, in the growth of the American Republic, this was all reinforced by Samuel Eliot Morison and Henry Steele Commager. This is a great disservice. Now, there weren't any great slave uprisings after 1831, but there were small rebellions. Spitting and urinating in food and drink before it was served. You could sort of smile and know what your master or mistress was getting. One young gal was executed for killing her mistress. And the way she did it was she collected spiders and collected their poison sacs from them and blended them into some buttermilk and served her mistress that. Edward Covey was given a young man to break because this young man had a very independent spirit. Not only had he tried to escape slavery, he had done something even worse. He had learned to read and write, and worse than that, he had educated other people in reading and writing. And that young man's name was Frederick Douglass. And he beat this young man. And this young man ran away to his owner, and he complained bitterly of his treatment. And his owner said, "No, you go back to Mr. Covey. You need to be broken." He went back to Mr. Covey, and Covey says, "I'm going to teach you a lesson for running away." And he said, "You know something? I don't think you are." And he fought him. He fought back. Covey called for help. His hired man came in and attempted to help. Frederick Douglass belted him in the stomach and folded him in half. After that, nobody else wanted to help. There was a hired slave from the next plantation, and Covey called upon him to help, and he said, "My master hired me out to help you with the crops, not to lay hands on another slave. Ain't doing it. You hit me, you're going to answer to my master." Well, that, of course, won the respect of Covey. Now, Covey, as a breaker of slaves, could not advertise the fact that he was so ineffective that, that he couldn't control this 15-year-old boy. So from then on, he just left Frederick alone. He gave him his orders, he did his work, and there was nothing going on. Now, a lot of people would think that because in the North, many a congregational pulpit and Unitarian pulpit was filled by an abolitionist, that you'd find some abolitionists in the Christian community in the South. That was not the case. In the South, for example, you had a person like the Reverend Mr. Whedon, mentioned by Frederick Douglass, living in Maryland, and a Reverend Rigby Hopkins, living also in the neighborhood, who actually had invested in slave women for the purpose of acquiring more slaves through fertilizing them and breeding them. And what did they preach in the South? They preached Genesis 9:20-27. And Ham laughed at Noah's nakedness, and God commanded that the children of Ham shall be the servant of servants, in other words, slaves. And Ham became the father of all of the black races. So if in a strictly fundamentalist view of things, that's how the black races originated. Of course, we know today that all of our ancestors, the ancestors of every single human being in this room, were black, came out of Africa, and over a period of 1.75 million years were dispersed throughout the world. So that wasn't quite right. Now, there was a fellow by the name of George Fitzhugh who called himself a sociologist. And he said, the white man was born booted and spurred to be master and protector over women, children, and the slave. Well, who was this guy? This guy was a ne'er-do-well. He was sort of a poor relation of plantation owners. And he actually inherited a rundown plantation. Sort of looked like Tara after the war. Before the war, sort of this rat-infested manor house, populated by rats and bats. But when he came into possession of this, he saw himself as heir to Southern plantation aristocracy. Now, he supported himself by a government clerkship in Washington, and he was a lawyer, not terribly successful, but he did practice law. He also was a painter. He also wasn't too successful as a painter. So anyway, he decided that he would write some books. He advertised himself as a Southern sociologist. And in 1849, he wrote a book called Slavery Justified. It was sort of a big seller in the South, followed by Sociology for the South, or the Failure of Free Society, in 1855, which coincidentally was the year in which Frederick Douglass published this particular version of his autobiography, My Bondage, My Freedom. This was the better buy of the two that year. And later on, he produced his great magnum opus entitled Cannibals, All or Slaves Without Masters. Cannibals All or Slaves Without Masters. Well, he didn't happen to mention the fact that the cannibals who tried to possess human beings wholesale happened to be the white planters. So he sort of had that one backwards. Well, anyway, Frederick taught himself to read. He taught himself to write. He stole copybooks from his master's young son. He wrote between the lines so he could imitate writing. He learned how the alphabet sounded, and he became one of the greatest voices, black or white, of the 19th century. There's something I'd like to read to you. And this is Frederick Douglass, just 7 years after escaping out of slavery. He is in his 20s, and I was struck by this when I was reading it. What I was struck by is how much it reminded me of the free blank verse of Walt Whitman. And if this was broken up, his observations on the Chesapeake would become a fabulous poem. I'm going to read it to you in that style. Those beautiful vessels, robed in purest white, so delightful to the eye of freedmen, were to me so many shrouded ghosts, too terrifying and torment me with thoughts of my wretched condition. I have often, in the deep stillness of a summer Sabbath, stood all alone upon the lofty banks of that noble bay, and traced with saddened heart and tearful eye the countless number of sails moving off to the mighty ocean. The sight of these always affected me powerfully. My thoughts would compel utterance, and there was no audience but the Almighty. I would pour out my soul's complaint in my rude way, with an apostrophe to the moving multitude of ships. You are loosed from your moorings, you are free, and I am fast in my chains. I am a slave. You move merrily before the gentle gale, and I sadly before the bloody whip. You are freedom's winged, swift wings, angels that fly around the world. I am confined in bands of iron. Oh, that I were free. Oh, that I were on one of your gallant decks, under your protecting wing. Alas, betwixt me and you the turbid waters roll. Go on, oh, that I could also go. Could I but swim, if I could fly, oh, why was I born a man of whom to make a brute? The glad ship is gone, and she hides in the dim distance. I am left in the hottest hell of unending slavery. Is that not wonderful poetry? He mastered that vocabulary. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. This man was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Not only was he physically capable of defending himself, but he wrote 3 stunning autobiographies. And if I had time, if were there world and time enough, I would you a tale tell. But alas, there is not.
we'd like to present a certificate of appreciation to you for appearing tonight in our author series hosted by Maurice.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you. Very kind.